let's talk about that bubble you mentioned earlier. What is life like in the bubble? Is there a bubble when you got to Jefferson City for the first time?
I think there definitely is, and I do have the vantage point of having worked for Senator Jim Talent in Washington, D.C., having experienced something pretty similar in Washington, where people really think that Washington is the center of the universe. And to a large extent, economically, it is. We send billions and billions, actually trillions of tax dollars there, and they spend it. And with power comes, I think, a lot of abuse of that power, and I think you see that on a micro scale in Jefferson City.
So what was your impression of the Jefferson City version?
I just
is it
think
working? Is it dysfunctional?
It works to a certain extent, but it's a pitfall. Anytime you have a culture in which you get a lot of elected officials with big egos and with a lot of money to spend and with a lot of lobbyists, there's potential for people to abuse that system.
And no campaign contribution limits, term limits. How do those things factor in? Do you, Andy, I'll throw it to you.
I really do think that what we saw in this session of the legislature shows that term limits have really not worked for the state of Missouri. We have too much new legislative, we don't have that talent, we don't have that experience base, we don't have the lifelong friendships that used to exist. I think that hurts. I think that hurts in the ability to make deals. I think it hurts in the ability to be productive.
Of course, we wanted term limits at one time, right, Joe? Because we thought that these were immovable institutions these individuals had become.
Yeah, and that's true. And it did remove some people that maybe needed to be moved out. But one of the effects of this is that the power base, the memory, the people who know how things operate, it's no longer in the chamber, it's outside the chamber. It's the lobbyists who wander around the third floor of the Capitol, many of whom are former legislators who are beholden to certain businesses or other groups who've been hired to lobby for against certain pieces of legislation. It's them and the bureaucrats who now are the people who are around the longest. And so you had a shift in power. They're the ones who know stuff. And the legislators of both parties, often, not only are they more beholden to their donors, because their donors are now telling them, you've got to vote on this while you're here, I can promise you a job, or this or that when you're out. They're beholden to that, but also they often tend to be, and this can be a good or bad thing, many people are elected with a certain philosophical views, strong views on how they think government should run. And because they're not there long enough to maybe see where maybe there's some sort of compromise, it doesn't happen. So you have more of a polarization between the two parties, between urban and rural, I mean, all the different factions in Jeff City, because nobody's there long enough to forge these relationships that the professor was talking about.
Correct me if I'm wrong, you can do 3 terms in the House, 2 years each. You can do 4 or 2 years, 2 terms.
4 terms in the House.
4 terms in the House.
2 years each.
And then 2 terms.
2 terms in the Senate, 4 years each.
For a total of 16 years.
Yes, and that's if you move from chamber to chamber, and only
Right.
a fraction of House members are going to end up in the Senate. And the House is 163 members. The Senate has 34.
Is that pressure real that she's talking about from the outside forces of people who know the machine that are not actually the elected officials?
I think there's some of that, but I think we're naive to think that lobbyists didn't have a whole heck of a lot of influence before term limits, or that they don't have a lot of influence in Washington, D.C., where there's no term limits. There's always pluses and minuses to things like term limits, but I think they help people like me who are younger, people who are just coming from regular professions. We're supposed to have a citizen legislature, and I think term limits are one of the best ways to ensure that you get regular people and not career politicians who are there for 20, 30, 40 years, like up in D.C.
What about the geography? So I brought up GQ with you and Jason earlier, but they didn't just, it wasn't just a, just an entertainment article. They quoted a piece out of the American Economic Review written by a Harvard professor in part that says geography is actually a factor. Isolated U.S. state capitals, cities are associated with higher levels of corruption, and that's because there's a lack of accountability the farther a capital is located from media organizations and the electorate. Is the fact that they are on a geographic island factor into the way that Capitol functions or does not function?
I think the media point is important there because there are no statewide media. It's you know, major metropolitan areas have news programs, but there is no statewide one. And so state capitals, particularly those that are located in the middle of a state in the rural areas, they tend to get less coverage than in the big cities.
Well, Jefferson City is somewhat of an island. I mean, it was created because it was halfway between Kansas City and St. Louis along the Missouri River, back before highways.
Move the capital from St. Charles, I believe.
Right, correct. So, and it's a really neat city, small town flavor, and people should go visit it. But it is a bubble. And so there's a huge percentage of the population who either is in government or works for government. And as a result, it's very much a company town. And I think if you're, let's say, speaker, you're head of the Senate or whatever, you're a big shot in that town. Now, this goes back, you know, decades, but you often had people who are big shots in Jeff City who aren't known outside of Jefferson City. That's one of the differences between it and Washington. I mean, Jim Talent was well known outside of Washington as well as in Washington. In Jefferson City, you can have most of the major players outside of the governor who really aren't known at all outside of Jefferson City, and that only comes into play when they're running for office or a higher office or something else, and they believe, because they've been treated like a big shot in Jeff City, that somehow they're going to be so well known, or somehow they're going to be able to get all these donors or this or that outside of Jeff City, and it doesn't happen. And I've seen that time and time again. The record of Missouri House speakers who've been elected to something else is really low.
Most people, at least on the other side of the state, probably didn't know who John Deal was before the Kansas City Star story.
Correct. In fact, probably even many in the St. Louis area, even though he's from the St. Louis area and a prominent lawyer.
Yeah. Okay, so ethics reform, that was on the don't or did not pass side of the graphic we had earlier. Is that important? Do we need that?
I think it's more important than ever now. I think what happened with the speaker really diminishes the whole profession of politics. It makes people think that people like me are in it for different reasons than we actually are.
The profession may have not had much farther to go in the downward direction. I don't know.
It can always go further. I mean, like congressional approval ratings, right? They're in the single digits, I think. They could always go down to just friends and family. But I just don't want us to be headed in that direction. And I think ethics reform is one of the things that I pushed for when I was a Baldwin alderman. And I was really glad that I was able to get an amendment onto our broader ethics reform bill in the House, requiring local elected officials basically to be governed under the same disclosure laws that we are. We have unlimited gifts, but at least if I take a meal from a lobbyist, I have to disclose it so somebody can say, oh, you took $24 from such and such, or you went out with someone for $100. Right now, local officials can take up to $500 of any type of gift, and they don't even have to disclose it under our state law. The scandal that's brewing there, I think, is one that journalists should pay attention to.
Well, and I think the representative brings up some good points. However, even if the ethics legislation had passed, which frankly had very little chance, even though there were some Republicans who were sponsoring it, it wouldn't have affected what happened to him. He's still, I mean, there was nothing about text messages in the ethics bills that were before the General Assembly, but it might have affected the atmosphere, at least the sense that people want to see some change. But that wasn't going anywhere even before the last week where everything blew up.
Sounds like you're saying there's no will to self-police.
Well, there's a will among some, but the problem is they haven't had a will among enough. And some of it, and I'm not saying I'm for or against term limits, but the fact is that term limits does, I think it reduces the urgency for it. Because you've got people who are like, well, this isn't going to affect me. I'm only going to be in the House 8 years. Why would this affect me? And in some cases, they're like, well, it'll affect me because I want to be a lobbyist after I get out. And this would make me wait a year or two, depending on the bill. And they don't want to do that. So it doesn't, the legislation hasn't had enough strong supporters who have stuck with it. I mean, the last major bill was passed in 2010, and it had some good stuff in it, but it got tossed out by the Supreme Court on unrelated matters, and that hasn't come back.
Andy, are the state governments, is Missouri state government, Illinois state government, are they maybe perhaps more in Missouri where there might be less of an appetite for federal programs? Are they flexing their muscles a little bit these days? You hear a lot of talk about government intrusion from the federal level, but and then at the same time, they are not afraid to ban a ban on plastic bags in Columbia, Missouri, and flex their muscles in other municipalities.
The state of Missouri really is flexing its muscles, and I would argue Illinois is going that direction as well. But the state of Missouri really has stepped up and made its disagreement with Washington known. It's also taking a closer look at the local level. I think that I think that the state has to be a little bit careful because the state does create cities, and a lot of cities are in distress. And if the state starts saying, hey, you really are creatures of the state and you have to listen to us, I think that the state also takes on a little bit of a burden to fix some of those problems that have happened since they created all those cities.
Is that a priority of yours to distinguish between the rights of the state government and the role of the federal government? Is that, because I hear that from your party oftentimes.
Right. I think what it really comes back to is the rights of the individual. One of the things that I was in support of that didn't make it over the finish line was preventing the taxi cab regulations that prevent Uber and Lyft from operating. There was a great article in the Business Journal, I think by the guy who started Lockerdome, saying that it was just flat out embarrassing that we don't have those type of ride sharing services. We're the largest city in the country that doesn't, and that's an issue where local government has taken it upon itself to tell you as an individual that you can't ride in a car with this person because there's a cartel out there who benefits from the system as it is. I think something like that protects individuals. Looking at something like raising minimum wages, one of the things we hear over and over from business is that they don't like the system of 92 municipalities because it's 92 sets of laws that they have to live under when they're trying to do business here. And things like a minimum wage, can you imagine crossing the street and having to pay a different minimum wage in one municipality from another? So I think it is the prerogative of the state government to step in some of those situations and say, we're going to have a uniform state rule so that people can have certainty and can live as free as they want to.
State governments are kind of right in the middle there, if at least maybe in your perspective. If you are trying to exert your power or your independence from the federal government and your power over the cities, as you said, that you've created.
But keep in mind that it was state governments that came together, wrote the Constitution that we live under, and gave up state power, gave that to the national government. States used to coin money. States used to run the military, and so they gave that power up to the national government. So if we go back a couple centuries, states really do have this very powerful role. It's diminished a lot over a couple centuries, and there are some states, Missouri and Texas certainly, that want to flex some muscles.
Okay.